I never thought the day would come when I'd walk into a boardroom with a flash drive tucked safely inside my purse, holding enough evidence to bring down one of the most powerful men in our company. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stepped across the polished marble floors, pretending I didn't notice the curious stares, the hushed murmurs. To them, I was just another mid-level manager, another cog in the machine. They had no idea that today I would pull the thread that would unravel everything. My name is Madison Cole. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed in hard work, loyalty, and the idea that if you just gave enough of yourself to a company, eventually it would reward you. I was wrong. For nearly 7 years, I had poured every ounce of my energy into Stratton and Chase, a high-powered consulting firm based in Chicago. I had built the client relations department from scratch, starting with nothing but a folding chair, a laptop, and a handful of cold leads. I had worked weekends, canceled vacations, and spent more nights sleeping in my office than I cared to admit. And for a while, it seemed like the sacrifices were paying off. I rose through the ranks faster than most, earning the respect of my colleagues and the cautious approval of the executive board. I became known for my results, my ability to turn struggling accounts into thriving partnerships, my relentless drive. There were whispers that I was a frontrunner for a vice president position that was opening up soon. I didn't allow myself to believe it entirely, but late at night, when exhaustion blurred my thoughts, I dared to hope. Then everything changed. 6 months ago, Stratton and Chase hired a new senior consultant named Amber Reed. She was 26, strikingly attractive, with a resume that, on closer inspection, seemed padded at best. She didn't seem to know much about consulting, but she had an effortless way of floating through meetings, charming senior executives, and laughing a little too loudly at the CEO's jokes. At first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Everyone deserves time to learn, I told myself. Everyone deserves a chance. But then the rumors started. Amber wasn't just another consultant. She was sleeping with Daniel Stratton himself, the CEO. I didn't want to believe it. It sounded too cliché, too pathetic. But the evidence piled up quickly. The secretive glances during meetings, the sudden promotions, the extravagant gifts she flaunted without shame. While I was grinding 14-hour days to hit impossible targets, Amber was posting photos from private wine tastings and luxury retreats courtesy of networking events. The final blow came 3 months ago. I was called into Daniel's office for what I thought was my long-awaited promotion discussion. I even wore my best suit, heart hammering with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Instead, Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, folded his hands, and informed me that due to budget constraints, my salary would be reduced by 20% effective immediately. It wasn't personal, he assured me. It was just business, a necessary step to streamline operations in a competitive market. I sat there, numb, as he delivered the blow with the same inflection he might use to order a coffee. 2 days later, the announcement came. Amber Reed was being promoted to Senior Vice President of Client Strategy, a newly created role with a generous 6-figure bonus and a corner office. I don't know how I made it through the rest of that day without tearing down every glass wall in that pristine building. For weeks after, I was paralyzed by a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I had done everything right. I had sacrificed everything, and for what? To be discarded like yesterday's news while someone who had done nothing earned everything I had worked for. I knew I couldn't let it go. I knew if I just walked away, they would win. So I did what any smart, broken, furious woman would do. I started paying attention. I started noticing the things I used to dismiss as background noise, the irregularities in financial reports, the hush-hush vendor contracts, the sudden surges in Amber's department expenses with no real results to show for them. Little by little, the picture began to form, and it was far uglier than I could have imagined. It turned out the affair was the least of Daniel's sins. Beneath the surface, there was something much worse, a massive embezzlement scheme that had funneled millions of dollars through dummy corporations and offshore accounts. And Amber wasn't just a pretty face enjoying the perks. She was a critical part of it, laundering the money through fake consulting services and ghost clients. The more I uncovered, the sicker I felt, and the angrier I became. They hadn't just stolen my promotion. They had stolen from every employee, every client, every shareholder who believed in Stratton and Chase. They had lied, cheated, and siphoned millions, all while treating loyal people like me as disposable. I realized then that I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't just walk away and let them get away with it. If I didn't act, no one would. So I made a decision. I started documenting everything, carefully, methodically. I saved emails, copied financial files, recorded conversations. I wasn't just going to get justice for myself. I was going to expose them for the frauds they were. I wasn't naive. I knew it would be dangerous. I knew it could cost me everything. But after what they had done, I had nothing left to lose. Today, as I stepped into the boardroom, clutching the tiny flash drive that held the truth, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to tear down the empire they had built on lies, ready to show them that the woman they thought they could bury was the same woman who would be standing over their graves, smiling when the dust finally settled. 7 years earlier, I had walked into Stratton & Chase with nothing but a degree, a few internships, and a dream of making something meaningful out of my career. I still remember my first day, how enormous the glass and steel lobby felt, how tiny I seemed walking across its marble floors with my cheap blazer and worn-out flats. I had been assigned to the newly created Client Relations Department, which at that point was little more than an idea. There were no procedures, no clients, no reputation. It was just me, a secondhand desk crammed into a corner near the supply closet, and a mandate to make it happen. I threw myself into it like my life depended on it. I cold-called prospects for hours, built templates, created presentation decks from scratch, and personally met with every nervous potential client who walked through our doors. I handled angry emails, smoothed over misunderstandings, and made it my mission to learn everything about the industries we served, from healthcare to energy to finance. I didn't have the luxury of mistakes. Every project had to be a home run. Success came slowly. At first, a client here, a small contract there, but over time, the numbers began to grow. Within 2 years, our client retention rate was one of the highest in the company. Within 3, we were pulling in millions annually. Senior partners began mentioning my name in meetings. Daniel Stratton himself once called me a rising star during a quarterly town hall. That moment had fueled me for months, convincing me that I was on the right track, that my sacrifices, late nights, missed holidays, relationships I never had time to nurture, were not in vain. By the 5th year, my department had expanded to a team of 8. I mentored new hires, helped design onboarding programs, and regularly trained junior associates in client engagement strategies. The success of my team became a key talking point in Stratton & Chase's investor briefings. I wasn't just meeting expectations, I was surpassing them. I lived and breathed the company, molding myself into the image of the perfect employee. But looking back now, I can see the cracks that had started to form even then. I had begun noticing how promotions didn't always go to the hardest workers, how some projects, no matter how successful, were quietly reattributed to senior executives who had barely touched them. I saw colleagues praised for ideas I had floated in meetings months earlier, ideas that had been dismissed when they came from me, but celebrated when echoed by someone else. I ignored it, convincing myself that the system was fair overall, that hard work would eventually outweigh politics. I kept my head down, kept delivering results. It was the only way I knew how to survive. By the start of my 7th year, whispers began to circulate that the vice president of client operations was planning to retire. People speculated openly about who would be tapped to replace him. My name came up often. Some even congratulated me in advance, assuming it was a done deal. I didn't let myself get swept up in it. Not fully, but late at night when the office was silent and I was working alone under the glow of my desk lamp, I allowed myself to believe it could happen. I imagined what it would feel like to finally have a title that matched my contributions. I pictured the new office, the meetings I would lead, the respect I had earned. I started researching leadership training programs, planning how I would build bridges with other departments, sketching out strategies to expand our client base even further. It wasn't about vanity. It was about validation, about the belief that maybe, just maybe, everything I had sacrificed was worth it. I didn't know then that Daniel Stratton had already made a different choice. I didn't know that while I was putting together revenue projections and client retention models, he was wining and dining a woman who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a dinner menu. I didn't know that while I was calculating how to optimize our service delivery pipeline, he was slipping corporate credit cards to Amber Reed to fund shopping sprees and private getaways under the guise of client development. I still remember the exact moment the illusion shattered. It was a Wednesday. I had just wrapped up a massive project, one that brought in a six-figure account from a notoriously difficult client. I was exhausted but proud. I thought, maybe foolishly, that I had finally earned my place. When the calendar invite appeared for a personal meeting with Daniel, my heart actually lifted. I thought it was happening. I thought this was it. I even called my mom that night, letting a rare note of excitement slip into my voice. Instead, I walked into Daniel's office the next day to find him leaning back in his chair, casual and detached, delivering the news like it was a minor administrative update, salary cut, budget reallocation. No discussion, no negotiation, just a polite corporate execution of everything I had built my life around. I remember sitting there, frozen, while he rattled off a list of platitudes about strategic realignment and market pressures. My mind didn't fully process the words until I was halfway back to my desk, the blood roaring in my ears. 2 days later, the email announcement went out. Amber Reed, Senior Vice President of Client Strategy. I read the subject line over and over again, willing it to make sense. When I clicked the email, I saw her smiling face plastered across the company newsletter, her new title bolded underneath, accompanied by a gushing write-up about her innovative leadership. Innovative leadership. The girl who needed me to explain the difference between gross revenue and net profit 2 weeks earlier. I sat at my desk in a daze for what felt like hours. Around me, the office hummed along, oblivious or deliberately blind. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone knew. The way Amber's hand lingered on Daniel's arm during conferences, the way she called him Danny behind closed doors, the way she always seemed to know about strategic decisions before anyone else. I was furious, yes. Humiliated, absolutely. But more than anything, I felt a cold, hard sense of betrayal. I wasn't naive. I knew corporate life wasn't always fair. But I had believed, stupidly maybe, that at least in my case, the work would speak louder than anything else. That night, as I sat in my small apartment staring at the city skyline, I realized I had a choice. I could walk away quietly, nurse my wounds, find another job, start over. Or I could fight. I could dig. I could find out exactly how deep the rot ran and make sure that Daniel and Amber paid for what they had done. Not just to me, but to every honest employee who had built this company from the ground up, while they played their little game. I chose the second option. I chose war. And I swore to myself that this time, I wouldn't stop until they were left with nothing. The first thing I learned about revenge is that you have to be patient. You have to let the anger cool into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. I spent the next several weeks watching, listening, pretending. I smiled in meetings. I congratulated Amber on her well-deserved promotion through gritted teeth. I sat through Daniel's town halls, nodding dutifully while he spewed corporate jargon about integrity and innovation. Inside, I was documenting everything. I started small, gathering financial reports, expense sheets, and vendor contracts that didn't quite add up. I had access to more than most, thanks to my years of handling client relations and cross-department budgets. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I only knew that people like Daniel and Amber didn't get greedy and stupid without leaving traces. It was a late Thursday evening when I found the first real crack in their perfect facade. I was reviewing quarterly vendor payouts when I noticed a series of unusually large payments to a consulting firm I had never heard of, Orion Solutions, LLC. The name was suspiciously generic, the invoices even more so. Vague descriptions like strategic alignment services and process optimization reviews, but no contact names, no project references. Curious, I ran a search on the company. What I found made my pulse quicken. Orion Solutions had been incorporated just 8 months ago, registered to a P.O. box in Nevada, a known haven for shell companies. There was no website, no staff list, no public records of any real work. I dug deeper. Over the course of 6 months, Stratton & Chase had paid Orion Solutions over $1,200,000, 0 cents. For what exactly, no one seemed to know or care. I checked the internal project management system. No deliverables, no project milestones, no meetings logged. It was as if the company existed solely to collect checks. And then I found it. The connection that confirmed my worst suspicions. A single internal memo, buried under layers of email chains, referencing a consulting partner contact, amber.reed@orionsolutionsconsulting.com. I stared at the screen, rereading it over and over. Amber wasn't just benefiting from favoritism. She was actively participating in a fraud scheme, funneling money out of the company through a fake consultancy she controlled. And Daniel, of course, was in on it. He had to be. The scale was too large, the paperwork too deliberate. They had created a ghost company to siphon millions under the noses of investors, employees, and regulators. It would have been easy, I realized bitterly. Stratton and Chase was growing fast, expanding into new markets, bringing on new clients at a dizzying rate. In the chaos, small anomalies could easily go unnoticed. Auditors trusted Daniel. Investors loved his quarterly growth reports. Who would question a few padded consulting fees when revenues were soaring? My hands trembled slightly as I printed out the key documents and hid them at the bottom of my personal filing cabinet. My instinct screamed at me to act immediately, to blow the whistle, to expose everything. But another voice, the one that had survived 7 years in corporate America, cautioned me to be smarter. I needed more. I needed to be thorough. If I was going to burn them down, I would do it so completely that there would be no doubt, no escape, no last-minute settlements to sweep it under the rug. I wasn't just seeking revenge, I was seeking annihilation. Over the next month, I worked 2 jobs, the one they paid me for, and the one they would one day regret giving me the access to perform. I combed through financial records late at night. I cross-referenced vendor databases, matched wire transfers to shell accounts, traced money flows through third-party service providers that were nothing more than empty office spaces with brass nameplates. I created a hidden network of evidence, meticulously organized, time-stamped, and I even started recording conversations where Daniel casually discussed consulting arrangements with Amber behind closed doors, never suspecting that the trusted, overlooked manager nearby was memorizing every word. I documented how Daniel approved additional bonuses to Amber's department without proper board review, how travel expenses were grossly inflated, how fake client visits turned into weekend getaways to Napa Valley and Aspen. Each new discovery fueled me, hardened me. The anger I had once felt had cooled into something far more potent, a grim determination to see this through, no matter the personal cost. Meanwhile, I played my part to perfection. I laughed at their jokes. I volunteered for extra assignments. I listened to Amber bragging about her leadership while she paraded around the office in designer clothes bought with stolen money. I attended happy hours, smiled for photographs, clapped at award ceremonies where Daniel praised her visionary strategy. Every act of pretense was another brick laid in the foundation of their downfall. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when I nearly lost it, when the weight of the deception, the suffocating hypocrisy threatened to crush me. One afternoon, Amber breezed into the office carrying a brand new Louis Vuitton tote, loudly announcing it was a little treat for closing a major deal. A deal I knew for a fact she had no part in. I smiled and complimented her bag, then went back to my desk and added another note to the growing file. There were close calls too. One night, Daniel's secretary stopped by my desk unexpectedly while I was transferring files onto a secure drive. I nearly fumbled the USB stick into my coffee. Another time, Amber's assistant caught me lingering near the records room after hours, and I had to invent a story about looking for misplaced contracts. I realized then how dangerous my game was becoming. If Daniel suspected even for a second that I was onto them, he would not hesitate to destroy me. He had the power, the resources, the ruthlessness. But the closer I got to finishing my work, the less I cared. I wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything they had taken from me, from the company, from the people who still believed that hard work mattered. I knew the clock was ticking. Every day I stayed, every file I copied increased the risk of exposure. But I needed one final piece, the confirmation that Daniel had personally authorized the offshore transfers. Without that, they could try to pin the fraud solely on Amber, paint her as a rogue employee, claim ignorance. I needed Daniel's fingerprints on the money trail. It finally came, almost by accident, on a Friday afternoon. Daniel left his office door slightly ajar after a conference call. I happened to pass by at the exact moment he was barking into the phone, furious about a delayed payment to a vendor partner. His voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and unmistakable. "I don't care what it takes. Get the funds moved through Orion by end of day. If compliance starts asking questions, we're all screwed." I froze, heart hammering. It was reckless, stupid, but it was exactly what I needed. I recorded the call through the office communication system, knowing the risk, knowing it could cost me everything if discovered. With that recording secured, I knew I had enough. Enough to bury them. Enough to make sure Stratton and Chase couldn't sweep it under the rug. Couldn't bribe regulators, couldn't frame a convenient scapegoat. I backed up everything onto 2 separate drives. One hidden at home, one encrypted and sent to a trusted legal contact I had discreetly hired. If anything happened to me, if they tried to fire me or silence me, the evidence would still surface. There was no going back now. Only forward, only through. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't the girl in the cheap blazer begging for a chance. I was something else now, something Daniel Stratton and Amber Reed should have feared from the moment they decided my loyalty, my work, my life were expendable. Soon they would learn exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. It was pretending everything was normal, while knowing that at any moment, everything could come crashing down. Every morning, as I walked into Stratton and Chase's glittering tower of glass and steel, I felt the tension coiled tighter in my chest. I smiled at colleagues, exchanged pleasantries with Amber in the elevator, nodded respectfully to Daniel when we crossed paths in the hallway. I attended meetings where budgets were discussed, where upcoming expansions were celebrated, where they all sat so smugly on top of their house of lies. I took notes, asked smart questions, and acted the part of the loyal soldier, all the while knowing that within a few weeks, it would all be gone. The pressure was unbearable sometimes. I would sit at my desk, staring blankly at my screen, my palms sweating, my heart racing as I imagined scenarios where Daniel discovered what I was doing. Imagine being escorted out of the building, losing everything I had worked so hard for, having my name smeared beyond repair. But then I would think about Amber's new Porsche parked in the executive garage, about Daniel's lavish bonuses while he cut employee benefits, about the loyal associates laid off under the guise of budget cuts while he and Amber funneled millions into their pockets. And my fear would harden into resolve. I wasn't doing this for revenge alone anymore. I was doing it because someone had to. Because if I stayed silent, I was complicit. The final phase of my plan involved not just exposing Daniel and Amber internally, but making sure outside forces would act before the company could bury the scandal. I knew Stratton and Chase would try to protect itself. It was a publicly traded company with millions at stake. The board would not simply hand me a medal for exposing their CEO's crimes. They would likely try to contain the damage, maybe even retaliate against me to save face. I needed leverage, something so public, so undeniable that they would be forced to act swiftly. That meant regulators, media, law enforcement. But first I needed a trigger, an event big enough to justify blowing the whole thing open. The upcoming quarterly shareholder meeting was perfect. It would be held in the main conference center with media invited, investors flying in from across the country, and a live webcast for anyone who couldn't attend in person. Daniel would be giving a keynote address about future growth strategies and showcasing Stratton and Chase's latest successes. It was the perfect stage for the fall. The weeks leading up to the meeting were torture. I refined my files, cross-checked my evidence, coordinated with the whistleblower attorney I had retained. We worked out the timing meticulously. I would release the documents and recordings to the SEC and a major business news outlet 20 minutes before the meeting began. The flash drive I carried would be handed to an SEC agent waiting in the city. Simultaneously, a confidential tip would go to the Financial Crimes Unit of the Department of Justice. I would also leak a package of carefully selected materials to a prominent financial journalist who had previously broken stories on corporate fraud. It wasn't enough to simply alert regulators. I needed the court of public opinion roaring for blood before the board could even consider circling the wagons. I rehearsed my movements like choreography. I knew exactly where I would sit during the meeting, what time I would slip out under the pretext of a client call, and where I would hand off the evidence. Everything was ready, everything was set. I just had to get there without tipping my hand. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I paced my apartment, checked and rechecked my backups, reviewed the plan until my eyes burned. I wrote a resignation letter and saved it to a thumb drive, just in case things went sideways and I needed to make a clean exit immediately. I packed a small overnight bag and left it by the door. I knew better than to assume things would go smoothly. People like Daniel Stratton didn't get rich and powerful by being careless. He was ruthless, and he would not go down without a fight. As dawn broke over the Chicago skyline, I made myself a promise. No matter what happened, I would not let them scare me into silence. The morning of the meeting, the atmosphere at the office was electric. Staff hustled around with final preparations, technicians checked microphones and lighting, assistants handed out glossy brochures touting Stratton and Chase's achievements. Ember floated through the crowd in a designer dress, basking in the attention, acting every inch the queen of a kingdom about to fall. Daniel arrived with his usual entourage, shaking hands, smiling for photos, radiating confidence. Watching him, you'd never guess that in less than an hour, his entire life would implode. I forced myself to go through the motions. I took my seat near the back of the conference room, carefully positioning myself near an exit. I checked my phone once, twice, confirming that the secure email with all attachments was ready to send on command. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the opening remarks. Daniel's voice boomed over the PA system, welcoming investors and guests, talking about bold vision and sustainable growth. Every lie slid so smoothly from his lips that I marveled at how practiced he was. He clicked through slides showcasing record profits, expanding markets, rising stock prices. The audience nodded, clapped, drank in the fantasy. At precisely 10:42 IMM, I slipped out of the room. No one noticed, all eyes were glued to Daniel's charisma on stage. I moved quickly but calmly through the side corridors, down the service elevator to the lobby, where an unassuming man in a gray suit sat reading a newspaper. Our eyes met briefly, and I slipped the flash drive into his open newspaper without breaking stride. I exited the building, walked a block away, and sent the scheduled emails from my burner phone. One to the SEC's whistleblower division, one to the journalist, one to my attorney. Within minutes, the detonations began. First came the journalist's social media post, a cryptic announcement about major corporate fraud exposure involving a Fortune 500 company with promises of details pending. Then came the SEC's acknowledgement receipt. Inside the conference room, I imagined the first few phones buzzing, the first few worried glances. I didn't need to see it to know the chaos that was about to unfold. By the time I re-entered through a side door and took my seat again, the temperature of the room had dropped noticeably. Daniel was still speaking, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a stiffness in his posture. Assistants clustered near the stage, whispering frantically. I caught Ember's face across the room. She looked pale, disoriented, clutching her phone like a lifeline. It didn't take long. 20 minutes later, two sharply dressed men in dark suits entered quietly through the back of the room. They spoke briefly with the board chairman, who blanched visibly. Daniel faltered mid-sentence, stammering something about a short break, but it was too late. The DOJ officials moved in, accompanied by SEC agents and company security. Murmurs turned into gasps as they approached the podium. Cameras, meant to broadcast Daniel's triumph, captured his confusion, his dawning horror, his furious denial as he was led away under arrest. Amber bolted from her seat, trying to push through the crowd, but she was intercepted by another pair of agents. The entire room was frozen, staring, too stunned to move. I sat very still, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching everything unfold exactly as planned, not with rage or satisfaction, but with a deep, profound sense of justice. They thought they could play the system forever, that they could cheat and lie and steal without consequence. They thought they could humiliate me, discard me, erase me. They were wrong. And now the whole world would see it. The chaos that erupted after Daniel and Amber's arrest was immediate and relentless. Stratton and Chase, once the epitome of corporate prestige, was thrown into a public relations nightmare, the likes of which no carefully crafted investor report or glossy annual review could hope to contain. News outlets swarmed the building within hours. By evening, our company name was trending across every major platform. not for market success or record profits, but for fraud, corruption, and betrayal. I sat at my desk, methodically sorting through client files as if it were just another ordinary Thursday, while around me, the world I had helped build crumbled. Panicked emails flooded the internal server. Emergency board meetings were scheduled. Lawyers rushed in like paramedics to a multi-car wreck, scrambling to triage the damage. The leadership vacuum was immediate and absolute. Daniel and Amber's swift removal left a gaping hole at the top, and no one seemed eager to step into the spotlight while regulators and journalists picked apart every transaction, every memo, every piece of dirty laundry Stratton and Chase had tried so hard to keep hidden. In the days they followed, investigators roamed the building with quiet authority, demanding files, seizing computers, interviewing anyone who had even the remotest proximity to Daniel's inner circle. Watching my colleagues' reactions was a study in human nature. Some played dumb, claiming no knowledge of the fraud. Others panicked, whispering in break rooms, deleting files, attempting to distance themselves from the scandal. A few brazen opportunists tried to position themselves as whistleblowers, conveniently forgetting how eagerly they had toasted Amber's promotion just months earlier. I kept my head down, letting the storm rage around me. I had no intention of drawing attention to myself. I had done my part. Now, it was time to let the consequences unfold. Despite my caution, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone came knocking on my door. Sure enough, 3 days after the arrests, a pair of stern-faced auditors from the SEC approached my desk, requesting a brief conversation. I nodded calmly and followed them to a small conference room on the 12th floor. The interview was professional but probing. They asked about my role in client relations, about my access to financial systems, about anything unusual I might have observed. I answered truthfully, but carefully, sticking to facts, never volunteering information beyond what was asked. I knew my official whistleblower report was already in their hands, backed by a mountain of evidence too comprehensive to dismiss. Still, I played the game, presenting myself as a concerned employee who had been shocked and dismayed by recent events. I let them draw their own conclusion. It wasn't hard. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. As the investigation deepened, details of Daniel and Amber's scheme leaked to the public. News anchors gleefully dissected the fraudulent vendor contracts, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. Headlines screamed about the betrayal of trust, the audacity of executives who had stolen from their own employees and investors. Stratton and Chase's stock price plummeted. Clients terminated contracts in droves. Lawsuits piled up faster than the legal team could process them. The board of directors, desperate to stem the bleeding, issued a series of frantic press releases promising full cooperation and a commitment to rebuilding trust. They announced an emergency leadership restructure and pledged to hold all responsible parties accountable. It was too little, too late. Within 2 weeks, Stratton and Chase was unrecognizable. The once bustling offices were half empty as employees fled for safer ground. Recruiters from rival firms lurked outside the building, poaching talent like vultures circling a dying animal. Morale was non-existent. Fear and resentment hung heavy in the air. No one knew who would be next to fall under scrutiny. No one trusted anyone else. The golden facade that had masked the company's rot for so long had shattered beyond repair. For my part, I kept working, fulfilling my duties with the same diligence I always had, but inside I felt a strange, hollow satisfaction. This was the reality Daniel and Amber had created, the inevitable result of their greed and arrogance. They had believed they were untouchable, that they could siphon millions and step over the bodies of the people who built their empire without consequence. Now they were facing federal charges, their assets frozen, their reputations in ruins, and I, the woman they had dismissed as expendable, was still standing. But survival wasn't enough. I knew I couldn't stay at Stratton and Chase forever. Even if the company somehow survived the avalanche of legal and financial disasters, it would never be the place I had once dreamed of building a future. Too much had been broken. Too much had been revealed. I needed to move on, to start fresh somewhere my skills and integrity would be valued, not exploited. Fortunately, fate seemed to agree. About a month after the arrests, I received a discreet message through LinkedIn from a partner at a prestigious rival consulting firm. They had followed the Stratton and Chase scandal closely and were impressed not just by my track record, but by my role unnamed but strongly implied in exposing the corruption. We arranged a meeting at a quiet downtown cafe. I dressed carefully, opting for professional but understated attire, determined to present myself as confident but not arrogant, competent but not vindictive. The meeting went better than I could have hoped. The partner, a woman named Lisa Monroe, listened intently as I outlined my experience, my approach to client relations, my philosophy of ethical leadership. She asked smart questions, pressed me on how I handled high-pressure situations, sought to understand not just my skills but my values. It was a refreshing change from the backroom deals and empty flattery I had grown used to at Stratton and Chase. A week later, I had an offer letter in hand, Senior Director of Client Strategy, a salary that dwarfed what I had ever made under Daniel's regime, full benefits, a signing bonus, and, perhaps most importantly, a culture that emphasized transparency, accountability, and respect. I accepted without hesitation. On my last day at Stratton and Chase, I packed my few belongings quietly, declining offers for farewell lunches or drinks. There was nothing to celebrate. I left my resignation letter on my manager's desk, walked out the front doors for the last time, and didn't look back. As I stepped into the crisp autumn air, I felt the weight that had pressed down on me for so long begin to lift. I had survived the worst they could throw at me. I had fought back and I had won. Not just by exposing their crimes, but by refusing to let their corruption define me. They had underestimated me, just as they had underestimated the power of truth. And now they were paying the price for their arrogance. Daniel and Amber would spend years fighting legal battles, their names forever tainted. Stratton and Chase would struggle to rebuild, forever marked by the scandal. And me? I was finally free. Free to rebuild, to thrive, to define success on my own terms. I wasn't just the woman they tried to break. I was the woman who turned their empire of lies into a pile of ashes and walked away stronger than ever. The aftermath of the scandal was like watching a slow-motion landslide, a destruction so vast and inevitable that even those who had once considered themselves untouchable were dragged down with it. Stratton and Chase's executive board, desperate to preserve whatever fragments of the company's reputation remained, launched a sweeping internal investigation. Heads rolled swiftly. Department heads were fired or forced to resign. Entire teams were dissolved, budgets slashed, policies rewritten under frantic new compliance mandates. Every contract, every transaction, every travel reimbursement was now subject to exhaustive scrutiny. The culture of smug entitlement that Daniel and Amber had nurtured collapsed in on itself, leaving only fear and resentment behind. Rumors swirled about mergers, about bankruptcy, about the firm being quietly absorbed by larger competitors eager to strip the carcass for valuable accounts and intellectual property. I watched it all from the outside now, detached, almost clinical. It was like observing a creature devouring itself, undone not by any external force, but by its own unchecked greed. Daniel and Amber's legal battles became tabloid fodder. Every sordid detail of their scheme was exposed. The dummy corporations, the falsified invoices, the extravagant expenditures masked as business expenses. Public sympathy was non-existent. Investors filed class action lawsuits. Former employees gave damning interviews to journalists, painting a vivid picture of a toxic culture where favoritism, fraud, and intimidation had flourished unchecked. Even those who had once idolized Daniel now spoke of him with contempt, eager to distance themselves from the wreckage. Amber, for her part, attempted a half-hearted defense, claiming she had been manipulated, a naive pawn in Daniel's master plan. It didn't work. The evidence was overwhelming. Her name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption. Neither of them would recover. Their careers were over. Their reputations were radioactive. They faced years of litigation, massive financial penalties, and the very real possibility of prison time. Meanwhile, I flourished in my new role at Monroe & Sterling Consulting. Lisa Monroe proved to be everything Daniel Stratton was not: principled, transparent, and genuinely committed to building something sustainable rather than chasing short-term profits at any cost. Under her leadership, the culture was collaborative, supportive, and driven by real results rather than backroom deals. For the first time in years, I didn't dread going to work in the morning. I didn't feel like I was constantly bracing for the next betrayal. I threw myself into the work with a renewed passion, leading my team through complex client transitions, landing major new accounts, and mentoring younger associates who reminded me so much of the woman I had been when I first walked into Stratton & Chase all those years ago. But even as I built a new future for myself, there were moments when the past reared its head. Sometimes it came in the form of a news alert, another update on Daniel's trial, another scandalous revelation. Sometimes it was a message from a former colleague, reaching out to express belated admiration for what I had done, or to seek advice on how to rebuild their own careers. And sometimes, late at night, it came in quieter ways. The memories of all I had endured, the friendships that had been casualties of that war, the small scars I carried inside. I didn't regret my choices, but I understood now that survival wasn't just about exposing villains or finding a better job. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, refusing to let what had been done to me define who I was. The most unexpected development came 6 months after Daniel's arrest, when I received a letter from the Department of Justice. It informed me that, based on my critical role in exposing corporate fraud, I was eligible for a substantial financial reward under the whistleblower provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. The figure they quoted made me sit down, stunned. It wasn't just a bonus or a small token of appreciation. It was life-changing. I hadn't pursued this path for money. I hadn't even known such rewards existed when I first decided to gather evidence. But there it was, formal recognition that standing up for what was right had tangible value, that the risks I had taken, the sacrifices I had made, hadn't been in vain. I used part of the money to pay off my remaining student loans, a burden that had hung over me for years. I donated a significant portion to organizations that supported women in business and fought corporate corruption. And I invested the rest carefully, laying the foundation for a future where I would never again be at the mercy of people like Daniel Stratton. The following year, Monroe and Sterling promoted me to Vice President of Client Strategy. It wasn't a hollow title handed out as a favor or a PR move. It was earned through real results and real leadership. I stood on the stage at our annual company retreat, accepting the award with genuine pride, knowing every person in that room respected me not for who I had exposed, but for what I had built. I thought about my younger self then, the woman who had sat trembling in Daniel's office, swallowing humiliation as he slashed her salary to make room for his mistress's promotion. I wished I could tell her it would all be worth it, that the road ahead, though brutal and lonely at times, would lead to something far greater than the approval of corrupt men. Not long after my promotion, I received an unexpected visitor. One of the former junior associates from Stratton & Chase, someone I had mentored years ago, requested a meeting. Over coffee, he told me he was starting his own consulting firm and wanted advice on building a culture rooted in ethics and sustainability. "You were the only one who showed us it was possible to survive with integrity," he said simply. That, more than any title or bonus check, felt like true victory, not just exposing corruption, but inspiring something better to rise from the ashes. In quiet moments, when the city lights shimmered outside my window and the hum of my new life settled around me, I thought about the path that had brought me here. I thought about ambition and betrayal, about power and survival, about the cost of standing alone. And I realized that while Daniel and Amber's story had ended in disgrace, mine was still being written, not by the lies others told about me, but by the choices I made every single day. I had built something no scandal could destroy. I had earned a life no one could steal. They had tried to silence me, to diminish me, to make me doubt my own worth. Instead, they had forged something stronger, something unstoppable. Justice, I learned, isn't always delivered in a courtroom or captured in a headline. Sometimes it's found in the quiet certainty that you did not yield. That when it mattered most, you chose truth over comfort, courage over fear. And in doing so, you didn't just survive, you won. It's strange how quietly life rebuilds itself after a storm. There's no grand trumpet blast, no dramatic montage of triumph. It happens in small, almost imperceptible ways. A morning without anxiety gnawing at your ribs. A project delivered without the fear of sabotage. A team meeting where ideas are judged on merit rather than politics. In the months following my promotion at Monroe and Sterling, My life settled into a rhythm that felt foreign at first. Stability was something I had never truly known in my career until now. I led my team with transparency and purpose, determined to foster the kind of workplace I had once only dreamed of. We celebrated wins together, took responsibility for failures without finger-pointing, and built trust the only way it can ever truly be built, one decision at a time. Looking back, it's almost surreal how far I had come from those hollow halls of Stratton and Chase, from the fake smiles and whispered betrayals, from the sickening realization that no amount of hard work could shield you from the petty greed of people who valued only their own advancement. When I thought of Daniel and Amber now, it was with a strange clinical detachment. Their names surfaced occasionally in industry gossip, always attached to another court date, another indictment, another desperate attempt to cling to whatever scraps of their former lives they could salvage. I felt no sympathy, no satisfaction in their downfall. They had sown their seeds and reaped their harvest. Their destruction wasn't my victory. It was simply justice finally catching up to them. Maybe victory was something deeper, quieter. It was in the mornings when I woke up excited for the day ahead. It was in the respect I saw reflected in the eyes of my colleagues, not born of fear or manipulation, but of genuine admiration. It was in the mentorship calls I took with young professionals seeking advice, in the quiet messages from women thanking me for being an example they could believe in. I had thought revenge would taste sweet, but what truly fed my soul was knowing I had built something lasting, not a fleeting act of retribution, but a legacy of integrity. One evening, as the city skyline glittered against the darkening sky, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, a space I had bought with my own earnings, free of guilt or compromise, and let the cool air wash over me. Below, the streets pulsed with life, thousands of stories unfolding in a city that had once nearly swallowed me whole. I thought about that young woman who had walked into Stratton and Chase full of hope, about the heartbreak she had endured, the betrayal that had nearly broken her. I thought about how she had chosen, when faced with the ugliest truths, not to turn away, not to shrink, but to stand and fight. She hadn't known then where that choice would lead. She hadn't known how much it would cost. But she had made it anyway, and because of her, I was standing here now, stronger, wiser, unbroken. Justice, I realized, isn't about seeing your enemies suffer. It's about reclaiming your own power, about refusing to let the worst parts of other people dictate who you become. Daniel and Amber had tried to define me by their betrayal. They had failed. I had defined myself, not by what they did to me, but by how I chose to respond. That was the victory no one could ever take away. As I finished my glass of wine and turned back toward the warmth of my home, I felt a deep, quiet certainty settle in my chest. The past was done. The battles had been fought and won. There would be new challenges ahead, new struggles, new victories. But whatever came, I knew this much for certain. I had faced the fire and walked through it. I had seen the worst and refused to become part of it. I had chosen to build, not destroy, to rise, not fall, and in doing so, I had won the only war that ever truly mattered, the one for my own soul.